Atlanta stands as one of America's most remarkable urban transformations, but beneath the gleaming skyscrapers and bustling highways lies a story that most people have never heard. Tonight, we'll uncover how a city that was literally burned to the ground rose from its ashes to become the unofficial capital of the New South, home to over 6 million people in its metropolitan area. This is the story of a phoenix that refused to stay buried. Atlanta has survived devastating wars, racial upheaval, economic collapse, and even Olympic terrorism to emerge as one of the most influential cities in America. We'll start with a surprising discovery in downtown Atlanta that reveals the city's forgotten beginnings, and from there we'll follow its relentless rise through triumph and tragedy over more than a century and a half. So just relax and let your mind drift as we explore the extraordinary history of Atlanta. When you think of Atlanta today, you might picture the world's busiest airport, the headquarters of Coca-Cola, or perhaps the gleaming towers of Buckhead reaching toward the sky. This city pulses with energy and ambition, a sprawling metropolis that seems to embody the very spirit of American reinvention. And indeed, Atlanta has reinvented itself more times than perhaps any other major American city. You can sense that this place has witnessed dramatic changes, that every street corner holds memories of transformation. The downtown core bustles with business travelers and convention goers, while the Beltline draws joggers and families exploring converted rail corridors. There's a palpable sense of progress here, of a city constantly looking forward. But if you dig just beneath the surface, you'll find layers upon layers of history that tell a far more complex story. In the 1990s, during construction work for the 1996 Olympic Games, archaeologists made some fascinating discoveries in downtown Atlanta. They unearthed remnants of the original city that existed before the Great Fire, fragments of buildings and streets that had been buried and forgotten for over a century. These artifacts revealed a bustling 19th century commercial district, complete with cobblestone streets and brick foundations that had somehow survived the inferno that consumed nearly everything else. It's remarkable to imagine that here, where modern office workers grab coffee on their way to meetings, an entirely different Atlanta once thrived and then vanished in smoke and flame. However, to truly understand Atlanta's story, we need to go back even further to a time when this area was nothing more than wilderness and scattered settlements. Before Atlanta existed, before there was even a thought of building a great southern city here, this region was home to the Cherokee Nation. For centuries, these indigenous peoples had established thriving communities throughout what would become North Georgia. They had developed sophisticated agricultural systems, built permanent towns, and created trade networks that stretched across the southeast. The Cherokee were not nomadic hunters as many imagine, but rather a settled people who had adapted European agricultural techniques while maintaining their cultural identity. They grew corn, beans, and squash in carefully tended fields, raised livestock, and even operated mills and trading posts. Some Cherokee had embraced Christianity and established schools, creating a unique blend of traditional and European influences. By the early 1800s, the Cherokee Nation had its own written constitution, a newspaper published in both Cherokee and English, and a capital city at New Ecota, located about 60 miles north of where Atlanta would eventually rise. This was a sophisticated society that had successfully navigated the challenges of contact with European settlers while maintaining its sovereignty. But the discovery of gold in North Georgia in 1828 changed everything. Suddenly, white settlers and prospectors flooded into Cherokee territory, driven by dreams of easy wealth. The state of Georgia, hungry for land and resources, began pressuring the federal government to remove the Cherokee entirely. This pressure intensified as cotton cultivation expanded and demand for new farmland grew. The Cherokee fought back through legal channels, taking their case all the way to the Supreme Court. In Worcester versus Georgia, they actually won, with Chief Justice John Marshall ruling that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee lands. But President Andrew Jackson famously ignored the ruling, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." The result was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the subsequent forced relocation known as the Trail of Tears. In 1838, federal troops rounded up Cherokee families from their homes and marched them westward to designated territory in what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way from disease, exposure, and starvation. It was one of the darkest chapters in American history, and it cleared the way for the creation of Atlanta. With the Cherokee removed, Georgia opened their former lands to white settlement through a series of land lotteries. Settlers poured in, establishing farms and small communities throughout the region. But it wasn't agriculture that would make this area significant. Instead, it was the railroad that would transform a small settlement into a major city. In the 1830s, railroad fever swept across America as entrepreneurs and politicians recognized the transformative power of steam transportation. Georgia's leaders envisioned a railroad that would connect the port of Savannah with the Tennessee River, opening new trade routes and bringing prosperity to the interior of the state. The route they chose cut directly through the rolling hills of North Georgia, and surveyors identified a spot where several rail lines could potentially converge. This location sat on a ridge that provided a natural break in the Appalachian foothills, making it an ideal place for trains to rest and take on supplies before continuing their journey through the mountains. The spot was originally called Terminus, reflecting its role as the end point of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. It was hardly impressive in those early days, just a collection of wooden buildings clustered around the railroad depot. A few dozen families lived there, mostly railroad workers and entrepreneurs, hoping to capitalize on the growing rail traffic. But Terminus had one crucial advantage: geography. Railroads naturally follow the path of least resistance, and this location offered the best route through the Georgia Piedmont. As more rail lines were planned and built, they inevitably converged on this same spot, transforming what had been a humble railroad town into a major transportation hub. In 1843, the town was renamed Marthasville in honor of the daughter of Georgia's governor. The population was still small, perhaps a few hundred people, but the foundations of something much larger were already being laid. Multiple railroad companies had established operations there, and businesses were springing up to serve the needs of travelers and freight operations. The real transformation began in 1845 when the town was incorporated and given a new name, Atlanta. The name was suggested by railroad engineer J. Edgar Thompson, who wanted something that sounded more sophisticated and forward-looking than Marthasville. Some say it was derived from Atlantic, reflecting the railroad's connection to the coast, while others claim it was simply chosen because it sounded modern and energetic. Whatever its origins, the name Atlanta captured the spirit of a community that was determined to grow and prosper. By 1850, the city had nearly 2,500 residents and was establishing itself as the railroad capital of the Southeast. 4 major rail lines now converged there, carrying cotton, timber, and manufactured goods to markets across the region. Atlanta in the 1850s was a boom town in the truest sense. New buildings went up constantly, many of them substantial brick and stone structures that reflected the growing wealth of the community. The city attracted merchants, lawyers, doctors, and craftsmen who saw opportunity in this rapidly expanding railroad hub. Hotels sprang up near the depot to accommodate travelers, while warehouses and freight yards expanded to handle the growing volume of cargo. Saloons, restaurants, and shops lined the dusty streets, creating a bustling commercial district that operated around the clock to serve the railroad schedules. The population was remarkably diverse for a southern city of that era. While the majority were white Southerners, drawn by economic opportunity, there were also significant numbers of Irish and German immigrants who had come to work on railroad construction. Free blacks operated businesses and skilled trades, though they faced increasing restrictions as tensions over slavery mounted. Enslaved people made up about 1/4 of Atlanta's population by 1860. Many worked in the railroad yards, hotels, and construction projects that fueled the city's growth. Others laboured in the growing number of small manufacturing operations that took advantage of Atlanta's transportation connections to reach regional markets. This was a city built on commerce rather than plantation agriculture, which gave it a distinctly different character from other southern cities like Charleston or Savannah. Atlanta's elites were railroad barons and merchants rather than plantation owners, and they were more focused on economic development than preserving traditional southern society. By 1860, Atlanta had grown to over 9,500 residents and was one of the fastest growing cities in the South. The railroad had made it prosperous, but that same railroad network would soon make it a target in the coming war that would reshape the entire region. As tensions between North and South escalated in the late 1850s, Atlanta found itself in an increasingly precarious position. The city's economy depended on trade connections that stretched across both northern and southern states, but its location firmly placed it within the Confederacy when war finally came. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, Atlanta's business leaders watched nervously as their carefully built commercial networks began to fracture. Some hoped that Georgia might remain neutral or find some middle ground that would preserve trade relationships, but such hopes proved futile as the crisis deepened. The attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War, and Georgia quickly joined the Confederacy. Atlanta's strategic importance was immediately apparent to both sides. The city's railroad connections made it a crucial supply hub for Confederate forces, while its manufacturing capabilities provided essential support for the war effort. Confederate authorities moved quickly to fortify Atlanta and expand its military production. Factories that had once produced textiles and consumer goods were converted to manufacture uniforms, weapons, and ammunition. The city became a major depot for collecting and distributing supplies to Confederate armies throughout the Southeast. The transformation was remarkable and swift. Atlanta's population swelled as workers, soldiers, and refugees poured into the city. What had been a prosperous but relatively quiet railroad town suddenly became a hive of military activity. The sound of hammering and construction echoed through the streets as new factories, hospitals, and military installations rose from the Georgia clay. The Confederate government established major supply depots throughout the city, taking advantage of those crucial railroad connections that had made Atlanta prosperous in peacetime. Trains arrived daily, carrying raw materials, and departed loaded with finished military supplies destined for battlefields across the South. The city's hotels overflowed with officers, government officials, and businessmen coordinating the war effort. But Atlanta's rapid militarization came at a cost. The focus on war production meant that civilian goods became scarce and expensive. Food prices soared as agricultural products were diverted to feed the Confederate armies. Many of the city's residents, particularly those without connections to the war industries, found themselves struggling to make ends meet as inflation ravaged their savings. Despite these hardships, there was an undeniable energy in wartime Atlanta. The city buzzed with activity and purpose as its residents threw themselves into supporting the Confederate cause. Women organized relief societies to care for wounded soldiers, while men too old for military service joined Home Guard units to defend the city. The Atlanta that emerged during these early war years was a far cry from the sleepy railroad town of just a decade earlier. It had become a symbol of Confederate determination and industrial might, a city that seemed to embody the South's belief that it could sustain itself through superior organization and willpower. However, this rapid transformation also made Atlanta an increasingly attractive target for Union forces. Northern military leaders recognized that destroying Atlanta's railroad network and manufacturing capacity would deal a devastating blow to the Confederate war effort. By 1863, Union strategists were already developing plans that would put the city squarely in their crosshairs. The first serious threat came in 1864 when Union General William Tecumseh Sherman launched his Atlanta campaign. Sherman understood better than most the strategic importance of Atlanta's railroad connections. He knew that capturing the city would not only deny crucial supplies to Confederate forces, but also provide a launching point for further operations into the heart of the South. The campaign began in May 1864 as Sherman's massive army of over 100,000 men began its methodical advance southward from Tennessee. Facing them was Confederate General Joseph Johnston with about 65,000 troops, tasked with the seemingly impossible job of stopping Sherman's juggernaut while protecting Atlanta's vital infrastructure. What followed was a masterclass in military strategy and tactics. Sherman avoided costly frontal assaults, instead using his superior numbers to outflank Confederate positions and force Johnston to retreat. Mile by mile, the Union Army pushed closer to Atlanta, while Johnston conducted a skillful fighting withdrawal that inflicted heavy casualties on the advancing forces. The campaign was marked by several significant battles that demonstrated both the ferocity of the fighting and the high stakes involved. At Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca, and Kennesaw Mountain, Confederate forces fought desperately to slow Sherman's advance, knowing that each day of delay might allow Atlanta's defenses to be strengthened. Atlanta's residents watched these developments with growing alarm. The sound of distant artillery grew louder each day, and streams of wounded soldiers arriving on trains provided grim evidence of the approaching danger. Many families began packing their belongings, preparing to evacuate if the worst came to pass. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, frustrated with Johnston's defensive strategy, made the fateful decision to replace him with the more aggressive General John Bell Hood. This change in leadership would prove disastrous for Atlanta's defenders, as Hood abandoned Johnston's careful defensive strategy in favor of costly attacks against Sherman's well-entrenched forces. Hood's first major assault came at the Battle of Peachtree Creek on July 20th, 1864. Confederate forces launched a desperate attack against Union positions just north of Atlanta, hoping to break Sherman's lines and force a retreat. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared killing field that decimated their ranks and left Atlanta's defenses critically weakened. 2 days later, Hood tried again at the Battle of Atlanta, sending his forces in another costly frontal assault that achieved nothing except further casualties. The pattern repeated at Ezra Church on July 28th, where Confederate attacks again failed with heavy losses. In just over a week, Hood had squandered much of Atlanta's remaining defensive strength in futile assaults. As summer wore on, Sherman tightened his grip around Atlanta like a closing fist. Union forces cut the railroad lines one by one, choking off the supplies that kept the city functioning. The Western and Atlantic Railroad, which had given birth to Atlanta, was severed first. Then the Georgia Railroad fell under Union control, followed by the Atlanta and West Point line. By late August, only one railroad remained open, the Macon and Western, which provided Atlanta's last lifeline to the outside world. Sherman recognized that cutting this final link would seal the city's fate, and he concentrated his forces for one decisive blow. The Battle of Jonesboro on August 31st and September 1st marked the end of Atlanta's resistance. Union forces overwhelmed the Confederate defenders, protecting the Macon and Western Railroad, cutting Atlanta's last supply line. With no way to feed his army or receive reinforcements, Hood had no choice but to abandon the city he had been sent to defend. On the evening of September 1st, 1864, Confederate forces began their evacuation of Atlanta. In a final act of destruction, they set fire to military supplies and ammunition that couldn't be carried away. The explosions lit up the night sky and could be heard for miles, a thunderous farewell to Confederate Atlanta. Sherman's forces entered the city the next morning to find it largely deserted. Many civilians had fled with the retreating army, while others had taken shelter in basements and hidden locations, uncertain of what Union occupation might bring. The Atlanta that had boomed as the railroad capital of the Southeast was now a conquered city, its fate in the hands of an enemy general who had already demonstrated his willingness to wage war against civilian infrastructure. Sherman immediately set about consolidating his position and preparing for the next phase of his campaign. He established his headquarters in downtown Atlanta and began the systematic destruction of anything that might be useful to Confederate forces. Railroad tracks were torn up and heated until they could be twisted around trees, creating what became known as Sherman's neckties. The general's attitude toward Atlanta's civilian population was complex and evolved during the occupation. Initially, he allowed residents to remain and even protected them from harassment by Union soldiers. However, he also made it clear that Atlanta's role as a Confederate supply center was permanently ended. In early September, Sherman issued one of the most controversial orders of the entire war. He commanded all civilian residents to evacuate Atlanta, declaring that the city would be converted into a purely military installation. The order sparked outrage from Confederate officials and pleas for mercy from Atlanta's mayor, but Sherman remained unmoved. His reasoning was brutally practical. Atlanta's strategic location made it impossible to hold without a large garrison, and that garrison could not be burdened with protecting and feeding civilian residents. Moreover, Sherman had already decided that his next move would be to march across Georgia to the sea, and he could not leave a hostile population in his rear. The evacuation began in mid-September and continued for several weeks. Families were forced to abandon homes they had spent years building, carrying only what they could manage in wagons or on foot. Many had nowhere to go, as the war had disrupted normal support networks and left much of the surrounding countryside devastated. Some residents attempted to hide or resist the evacuation order, but Union soldiers systematically searched the city and forced out anyone they found. The scenes were heartbreaking, as elderly residents and families with small children were compelled to leave everything behind and venture into an uncertain future. By October, Atlanta had been transformed into a hollow shell of its former self. The bustling commercial district stood empty, its windows dark and streets eerily quiet. Only Union soldiers and a handful of civilian contractors remained in a city that had once been home to thousands of families. Sherman spent the next several weeks preparing for his march to the sea, using Atlanta as a base to reorganize his forces and accumulate supplies. His engineers worked tirelessly to destroy anything that might be useful to Confederate forces, methodically dismantling the railroad infrastructure that had made Atlanta possible. Then came the decision that would forever scar Atlanta's memory and create one of the most enduring images of the Civil War. Sherman ordered the systematic destruction of Atlanta's commercial and industrial districts, ensuring that the city could never again serve as a Confederate supply center. On November 16th, 1864, the fires began. The flames started in the railroad roundhouse and spread methodically through Atlanta's heart. Union soldiers moved from building to building with torches and combustible materials, following Sherman's orders to destroy anything that could aid the Confederate war effort. What began as targeted military destruction soon became something far more comprehensive. Sherman had intended to limit the burning to military and industrial targets, but fire has its own logic. The wooden buildings and narrow streets of 1860s Atlanta provided perfect conditions for the flames to jump from structure to structure. Soon, entire city blocks were consumed in an inferno that painted the November sky a hellish orange. From his temporary headquarters, Sherman watched the destruction with mixed emotions. He understood the military necessity of his actions, but he was not immune to the tragedy of seeing a once thriving city reduced to ashes. Years later, he would write that the sight of burning Atlanta was both terrible and beautiful, a contradiction that captured the complex nature of this moment in American history. The fire burned for days, consuming roughly 40% of Atlanta's buildings. The commercial district was almost completely destroyed, along with most of the railroad infrastructure that had given birth to the city. Churches, schools, and hundreds of homes disappeared in the flames, leaving behind only brick chimneys and foundations as monuments to what had once been. Contemporary accounts describe an apocalyptic scene. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from dozens of miles away. The sound of collapsing buildings echoed through the empty streets, punctuated by the occasional explosion as flames reached stores of ammunition or chemicals. At night, the glow could be seen from surrounding counties, a beacon of destruction that announced the Confederacy's declining fortunes. On November 16th, Sherman's army finally departed Atlanta, beginning their famous march to the sea. Behind them lay a city transformed from a bustling railroad hub into a landscape of ruins and rubble. The few residents who remained hidden in the outskirts emerged to find their hometown virtually erased from the map. The Atlanta that Sherman left behind was barely recognizable. Where busy streets had once teemed with merchants and travelers, only charred foundations and twisted metal remained. The depot that had welcomed thousands of passengers and countless freight cars was reduced to a pile of blackened bricks. The hotels where Confederate officers had planned their campaigns were now skeletal remains against the Georgia sky. Yet even in this moment of complete devastation, the seeds of Atlanta's rebirth were already present. The city's greatest asset had never been its buildings or even its railroad infrastructure, but rather its strategic location. Geography doesn't burn, and the natural advantages that had made Atlanta a railroad hub in the first place remained intact. As winter settled over the ruins, a few hardy souls began returning to what remained of their city. They found a wasteland, but they also found opportunity. Land that had once commanded premium prices was now available for almost nothing. The railroad companies, despite their massive losses, recognized that Atlanta's location remained as valuable as ever. The first priority was simply survival. Returning residents lived in makeshift shelters constructed from salvaged materials, using pieces of destroyed buildings to create new homes. Food was scarce, and many families depended on charity from relief organizations and the few functioning farms in the surrounding countryside. But Atlanta's people possessed something that proved more valuable than any physical infrastructure: an unshakable belief in their city's future. These early returnees were not content to simply rebuild what had been destroyed. Instead, they envisioned something grander, a city that would not only recover from the war, but emerge stronger than before. The federal government's Reconstruction policies initially hindered Atlanta's recovery efforts. Military occupation continued for several years after the war's end, and federal officials were often suspicious of Southern attempts to rebuild industrial capacity. However, Atlanta's business leaders proved remarkably adept at working within the constraints of Reconstruction, while positioning their city for future growth. One of the most important early decisions was the choice to rebuild Atlanta as a modern city rather than simply reconstructing what had been destroyed. The old street patterns had been cramped and irregular, reflecting the city's haphazard growth during the railroad boom. Now, planners had the opportunity to create broader avenues and more rational layouts that could accommodate future expansion. The railroad companies were among the first to recognize Atlanta's continued potential. Despite the enormous cost of rebuilding their infrastructure, they understood that Atlanta's geographic advantages remained undiminished. Work began almost immediately on reconstructing the rail lines and depot facilities that had been the city's lifeblood. By 1866, the first trains were once again rolling into Atlanta, carrying supplies and passengers to a city that was slowly emerging from its ashes. The sight of locomotives pulling into the rebuilt depot became a powerful symbol of Atlanta's determination to reclaim its position as the transportation hub of the Southeast. The human spirit of resilience that emerged during these early Reconstruction years would become a defining characteristic of Atlanta's identity. Stories of families who lost everything but refused to give up became part of the city's folklore, creating a culture that celebrated perseverance and reinvention over tradition and past glories. One particularly inspiring example was that of the Morris family, who had operated a successful dry goods store before the war. They returned to find their business completely destroyed, but rather than despair, they saw an opportunity to create something better. Using insurance money and borrowed capital, they built a new store that was larger and more modern than their previous establishment. Similar stories played out across the city as entrepreneurs, both local and from other regions, recognized the opportunities presented by Atlanta's rebuilding process. Northern investors, despite the lingering tensions from the war, began arriving with capital and expertise. They were attracted not by sentiment, but by the practical advantages of Atlanta's location and the determination of its people. The city's population began growing again, though slowly at first. Many former residents had scattered during the evacuation and found new homes elsewhere. However, the promise of economic opportunity drew new arrivals to replace those who had left. These newcomers brought fresh ideas and energy that complemented the determination of the returning natives. Religious institutions played a crucial role in Atlanta's early recovery. Churches that had been destroyed were rebuilt quickly, often with volunteer labor from the entire community. These buildings served not only as places of worship, but as community centers where residents could gather to plan reconstruction efforts and support each other through the difficult early years. The African American community faced particularly complex challenges during this period. The end of slavery had fundamentally altered social relationships throughout the South, and Atlanta was no exception. Formerly enslaved people found themselves free but without property or resources, while former slaveholders struggled to adapt to a world without forced labor. Despite these challenges, Atlanta's black community began establishing its own institutions and businesses with remarkable speed. Churches became centers of social and economic activity, while schools emerged to provide education for children and adults who had been denied literacy under slavery. These institutions would play crucial roles in Atlanta's development over the coming decades. The city's first post-war newspaper, the Atlanta Constitution, began publication in 1868 under the leadership of Henry Grady, who would become one of the most influential voices in promoting Atlanta's recovery. Grady understood that the city's future lay not in mourning its Confederate past, but in embracing a new identity as a modern, progressive Southern city. Through his editorials and speeches, Grady promoted what he called the New South, a vision of the region that emphasized industrial development, educational advancement, and economic diversification. Atlanta, rising from its own ashes, became the perfect symbol of this new vision. By 1870, Atlanta's population had recovered to pre-war levels, and the city was once again a bustling railroad hub. The scars of destruction were still visible in vacant lots and hastily constructed buildings, but there was an unmistakable energy in the air. This was a city that had looked death in the face and emerged with renewed purpose. The 1870s brought accelerated growth as Atlanta's strategic advantages became increasingly apparent to investors and businesses throughout the region. The railroad network expanded beyond its pre-war scope, connecting Atlanta to new markets and sources of raw materials. Cotton mills began springing up around the city, taking advantage of both transportation links and the availability of workers displaced by the war's aftermath. Manufacturing diversified beyond textiles to include lumber processing, metalworking, and food production. Each new industry created jobs and attracted more residents, feeding a cycle of growth that would continue for decades. Atlanta was not just rebuilding, it was transforming itself into something entirely new. The city's educational system also began taking shape during this period. Public schools, which had been limited before the war, expanded to serve both white and black students, though in strictly segregated facilities. Private academies and colleges established campuses in Atlanta, recognizing the city's growing importance and the educational needs of its expanding population. Cultural life slowly returned to Atlanta as prosperity increased. Theaters reopened, offering everything from Shakespeare to popular musical revues. Social clubs and civic organizations formed to address community needs and provide entertainment for residents who had survived years of hardship and uncertainty. The Atlanta of 1875 bore little resemblance to the smoldering ruins Sherman had left behind a decade earlier. New buildings rose higher than their predecessors, constructed with improved materials and modern techniques. Gas streetlights illuminated broader avenues designed to handle increased traffic and commerce. Most importantly, Atlanta had developed a new sense of identity that would carry it through future challenges and opportunities. This was no longer just a railroad town that had grown by accident of geography. It was a city with purpose and vision, determined to become the leading metropolis of the New South. The phoenix had indeed risen from the ashes, but its greatest flights were still ahead. The transformation of Atlanta during the late 1870s and 1880s was nothing short of extraordinary. The city that had once been reduced to smouldering rubble was now emerging as the undisputed leader of what Henry Grady championed as the New South movement. But this rapid growth came with its own set of challenges and contradictions that would define Atlanta's character for generations to come. By 1880, Atlanta's population had swelled to nearly 40,000 residents, making it one of the fastest growing cities in America. The railroad network had expanded far beyond its pre-war configuration, with new lines stretching in every direction, like spokes on a giant wheel. The city had become the primary distribution point for goods flowing between the industrial north and the agricultural south, a role that brought immense prosperity but also new complexities. The downtown business district buzzed with activity from dawn to dusk. 5 points where the major streets converged had become the beating heart of southern commerce. Here, cotton merchants negotiated deals that would send raw materials to textile mills in New England, while northern manufacturers opened regional offices to serve the growing southern market. The sound of hammering and construction echoed through the streets as new buildings rose to accommodate this expanding economy. However, Atlanta's rapid industrialization created stark divisions within the city. The business elite, many of whom had arrived from other regions with capital and connections, built magnificent mansions along Peachtree Street and in the emerging Inman Park neighborhood. These grand homes featured the latest Victorian architecture, complete with elaborate gardens and modern conveniences that showcased their owners' prosperity. Meanwhile, the working classes lived in very different circumstances. Mill villages sprang up around the textile factories, where entire families worked long hours for modest wages. These communities were largely self-contained, with company-owned housing, stores, and even churches. While they provided employment for thousands of rural migrants seeking better opportunities, they also created a rigid class structure that would persist for decades. The African American experience during this period was particularly complex. Despite the end of slavery, the promise of Reconstruction had largely been abandoned by the federal government, leaving Black Atlantans to navigate a world of limited opportunities and increasing restrictions. Nevertheless, the city's Black community demonstrated remarkable resilience and entrepreneurship. Auburn Avenue began emerging as the center of Black business and social life in Atlanta. Here, African American entrepreneurs established banks, insurance companies, newspapers, and retail establishments that served their community's needs. Churches like Ebenezer Baptist Church became not only spiritual centers, but also focal points for education and social organization. The establishment of Atlanta University in 1865 had created an important foundation for Black education in the city. This institution, along with several other historically Black colleges that would eventually form the Atlanta University Center, attracted students and faculty from across the South. These schools produced teachers, ministers, doctors, and business leaders who would play crucial roles in Atlanta's development. Yet the gains of Reconstruction were increasingly under attack as the 1880s progressed. The rise of Jim Crow laws systematically stripped away many of the rights that Black Atlantans had briefly enjoyed. Segregation became more rigid and comprehensive, affecting everything from public transportation to entertainment venues. The promise of racial equality that had briefly flickered during Reconstruction was being systematically extinguished. Despite these social tensions, Atlanta's economic momentum continued to accelerate. The city's strategic location made it an ideal headquarters for businesses seeking to serve the entire Southeast. Insurance companies, banks, and manufacturing firms established regional offices there, bringing white-collar jobs and professional expertise that further diversified the economy. The Exposition of 1881 marked a crucial moment in Atlanta's emergence as a regional power. This grand fair, held on the grounds of what would later become Piedmont Park, showcased the city's industrial achievements to visitors from across the nation. The exposition featured exhibits on everything from textile manufacturing to agricultural innovation, demonstrating that the South was indeed rising from the ashes of war. More than 200,000 visitors attended the exposition, many of them northern businessmen and investors who came away impressed by Atlanta's potential. The event generated enormous publicity for the city and helped establish its reputation as the progressive face of the New South. For many Americans, Atlanta became synonymous with Southern recovery and modernization. Henry Grady used the exposition as a platform to promote his vision of sectional reconciliation and economic development. His speeches during this period articulated a philosophy that would guide Atlanta's growth for decades. The South could prosper by embracing industrial development while maintaining its distinctive cultural identity. This message resonated with both local audiences and northern investors who were eager to find stable markets for their products. The 1880s also saw significant improvements in Atlanta's infrastructure and quality of life. Gas lighting gave way to electric street lights, making the city one of the first in the South to embrace this new technology. Telephone service arrived, connecting Atlanta's business district to the wider world of commerce and communication. Street railways began carrying passengers between downtown and the growing residential neighborhoods. These improvements reflected Atlanta's determination to compete with established cities like Charleston, New Orleans, and Richmond for regional leadership. Unlike these older cities, which were often constrained by their historic layouts and traditional approaches, Atlanta had the advantage of being essentially rebuilt from scratch. This allowed for more rational street patterns, modern utilities, and innovative approaches to urban planning. The city's cultural life also began to flourish during this period. The Atlanta Constitution, under Henry Grady's leadership, became one of the most influential newspapers in the South. Its editorials shaped public opinion not only in Atlanta, but throughout the region, promoting industrial development and sectional reconciliation while carefully navigating the racial tensions of the era. Theatre and music venues opened to serve Atlanta's growing middle class. The Grand Opera House, completed in 1893, hosted touring productions from New York and featured local performers as well. Social clubs and civic organisations proliferated, providing forums for the city's elite to network and plan future development projects. Education became increasingly important as Atlanta's economy grew more sophisticated. In addition to the historically black colleges, the city attracted white institutions of higher learning. The Georgia Institute of Technology, established in 1885, reflected Atlanta's commitment to technical education and industrial development. This engineering school would eventually become one of the nation's premier technical universities. Public education also expanded, though within the constraints of racial segregation. White schools received the bulk of funding and resources, while black schools operated with minimal support. Nevertheless, the African American community's commitment to education remained strong, with churches and private organizations supplementing the inadequate public provisions. The 1890s brought both triumph and tragedy to Atlanta. The city's population continued to grow, reaching nearly 90,000 by 1900. New neighborhoods spread outward from the downtown core, connected by an expanding network of streetcar lines. The business district grew denser and taller, with some of the South's first skyscrapers rising along Peachtree Street. However, this period of growth was marred by increasing racial tensions that would culminate in one of the darkest chapters in Atlanta's history. The economic competition between black and white workers, combined with inflammatory newspaper coverage and political demagoguery, created a volatile atmosphere that would soon explode into violence. The Spanish-American War of 1898 provided a temporary distraction from domestic tensions while further boosting Atlanta's economy. The city served as a major supply and training center for troops headed to Cuba, bringing federal spending and national attention. Local industries expanded to meet military contracts, while hotels and restaurants prospered from the influx of soldiers and officials. As the 19th century drew to a close, Atlanta stood as perhaps the greatest success story of post-Civil War American urban development. A city that had been literally erased from the map just 35 years earlier was now home to nearly 100,000 people and served as the economic hub of the Southeast. Its railroad network connected it to every major city in the nation, while its industries produced goods that competed in national and international markets. The skyline had been transformed as well. Where Sherman soldiers had once gazed upon smoking ruins, visitors now saw a forest of church spires, factory smokestacks, and increasingly tall commercial buildings. Electric lights illuminated busy streets, where horse-drawn carriages and early automobiles competed for space with streetcars and pedestrians. Yet beneath this prosperity lay deep fault lines that threatened Atlanta's continued progress. The rigid system of racial segregation that had replaced slavery created two separate and unequal cities within the same geographic boundaries. While white Atlanta celebrated its achievements and planned for an even brighter future, black Atlanta faced increasing restrictions and the constant threat of violence. The economic system that had fueled Atlanta's remarkable growth also created stark inequalities of wealth and opportunity. The mill villages and working-class neighborhoods that housed the city's laborers bore little resemblance to the elegant mansions of Inman Park and Ansley Park. Child labor was common in the textile mills, and workplace safety standards were minimal or non-existent. Environmental concerns were largely ignored in the rush for economic development. The Chattahoochee River and its tributaries became increasingly polluted as industries dumped waste without regulation. Air quality deteriorated as coal-powered factories and locomotives filled the atmosphere with soot and smoke. These problems would only worsen as the city continued to grow. Nevertheless, Atlanta's achievements during the late 19th century were undeniable. From the ashes of total destruction had risen a modern American city that rivaled much older and more established urban centers. The Phoenix metaphor that would become central to Atlanta's identity was not merely poetic rhetoric, but a literal description of one of the most remarkable urban transformations in American history. The city's leaders looked toward the new century with confidence and ambition. Plans were already underway for even grander projects that would cement Atlanta's position as the capital of the New South. A new Union passenger terminal would handle the growing railroad traffic, while expanded streetcar lines would connect ever more distant suburbs to the downtown core. However, the challenges facing Atlanta as it entered the 20th century were as significant as its opportunities. The racial tensions that had been building throughout the 1890s were approaching a crisis point that would test the city's character and values. The economic inequality that had accompanied rapid industrialization demanded attention if Atlanta was to maintain social stability. The environmental costs of unregulated growth were becoming increasingly apparent, while the infrastructure needs of a rapidly expanding city strained municipal resources. These challenges would define Atlanta's development in the coming decades, determining whether the Phoenix, that had risen so dramatically from Civil War ashes, could sustain its flight into a new century. What remained constant was the spirit of determination and reinvention that had characterized Atlanta since its earliest days as a railroad town. This was a city that had never accepted limitations, never been content with the status quo, never stopped believing that its greatest achievements lay ahead rather than behind. As 1900 approached, Atlanta stood poised between its remarkable past and an uncertain but promising future, a city that had already proven its capacity for transformation and was preparing for even greater challenges ahead. The dawn of the 20th century found Atlanta brimming with confidence and ambition, but the city's rapid ascent would soon be tested by forces that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of its society. The prosperity and progress of the 1890s had created a powder keg of social tensions that would explode in ways that shocked the nation and forced Atlanta to confront the contradictions at the heart of its New South identity. The first years of the new century saw continued economic expansion as Atlanta solidified its position as the Southeast's premier commercial center. The completion of Terminal Station in 1905 created one of the most impressive railroad facilities in the South, a magnificent structure that could handle the ever-increasing flow of passengers and freight through the city. This architectural marvel, with its soaring arches and elegant waiting rooms, became a symbol of Atlanta's determination to compete with the great cities of America. Cotton remained king in much of the South, but Atlanta had successfully diversified beyond its agricultural roots. Textile mills hummed with activity, processing raw cotton into finished goods that competed in national markets. The Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill employed thousands of workers, creating one of the largest industrial complexes in the region. Steel foundries and machine shops supplied equipment for the expanding railroad network, while lumber mills processed the vast forests of Georgia into building materials for the city's continued growth. The business district continued its upward expansion, with new office buildings rising higher than their predecessors. The Candler Building, completed in 1906, showcased the latest in steel frame construction and electric elevators. From its upper floors, one could gaze across a cityscape that bore no resemblance to the collection of wooden structures that had existed before the war. Peachtree Street had emerged as the city's grand boulevard, lined with fashionable shops, hotels, and professional offices. The Piedmont Hotel attracted visitors from across the nation, while department stores like Rich's offered the latest fashions from New York and Paris. Electric streetcars glided along broad avenues, carrying passengers between downtown and the expanding residential neighborhoods that sprawled in every direction. The suburban development that characterized early 20th century Atlanta reflected both the city's prosperity and its rigid social hierarchies. Inman Park, developed in the 1890s, had established the template for elite residential neighborhoods with its tree-lined streets and elaborate Victorian mansions. Annesley Park followed in the early 1900s, featuring even grander homes designed in the latest architectural styles. These exclusive enclaves were connected to downtown by private streetcar lines that ensured convenient transportation for their affluent residents. The neighborhoods featured wide boulevards, extensive parks, and restrictive covenants that maintained their exclusive character. Here lived the railroad executives, textile magnates, and merchants who had built Atlanta's post-war economy. Working-class whites found housing in neighborhoods like Cabbagetown, which grew up around the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill. These mill villages provided modest homes for factory workers and their families, along with company stores, schools, and churches. While the accommodations were basic, they represented significant improvements over rural conditions for many families who had migrated to the city seeking better opportunities. The African American community faced far more restrictive housing options as Jim Crow laws increasingly segregated the city's neighborhoods. The Fourth Ward, centered around Auburn Avenue, became the heart of Black Atlanta. Despite the limitations imposed by segregation, this area developed a vibrant business district that served the needs of the city's growing black population. Auburn Avenue earned the nickname Sweet Auburn for the prosperity that flourished there despite the constraints of segregation. Black-owned banks, insurance companies, newspapers, and retail establishments created a parallel economy that provided services denied to African Americans in white-owned businesses. The Atlanta Life Insurance Company, founded by Alonzo Herndon, became one of the most successful black-owned businesses in the nation. The historically black colleges continued to play crucial roles in educating leaders for the African American community. Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College attracted students from across the South and beyond. These institutions produced teachers, ministers, doctors, and business leaders who would challenge segregation and work for civil rights in the decades to come. However, the apparent stability of this segregated society masked growing tensions that would soon explode into violence. Economic competition between black and white workers intensified as Atlanta's industrial growth created new job opportunities. White workers, many of them recent migrants from rural areas, resented what they perceived as unfair competition from black labourers who were often willing to work for lower wages. The city's newspapers, particularly the Atlanta Georgian, published sensationalized stories about alleged crimes by black men against white women. These inflammatory reports created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that politicians exploited for their own purposes. The gubernatorial campaign of 1906 featured candidates competing to demonstrate their commitment to white supremacy and their willingness to put black Atlantans in their place. The summer of 1906 brought a series of events that would culminate in one of the most shameful episodes in Atlanta's history. Newspaper headlines screamed about alleged assaults, while political rallies featured speakers denouncing black citizens in increasingly violent language. The temperature rose both literally and figuratively as September approached, creating conditions ripe for explosion. On the evening of September 22nd, 1906, the powder keg finally exploded. Fueled by alcohol, inflammatory newspaper reports, and speeches by political demagogues, a white mob began gathering in downtown Atlanta. What started as angry talk soon turned to violence as the crowd moved through the city's streets, attacking any African American they encountered. The Atlanta Race Riot of 1906 lasted for several days and shocked the entire nation. Mobs of white attackers invaded black neighborhoods, destroying businesses and homes while terrorizing residents. The violence was particularly intense along Auburn Avenue, where many of the city's most successful black-owned enterprises were damaged or destroyed. African American residents fought back, defending their homes and families with whatever weapons they could find. Barricades went up in black neighborhoods as residents prepared for siege conditions. The city's small police force was overwhelmed and, in many cases, unwilling to protect black citizens from white attackers. The violence finally ended only when state militia units arrived to restore order. The official death toll was relatively modest, but the psychological and economic damage to Atlanta's black community was enormous. Many successful businesses never reopened, while families lost their homes and possessions to the mob violence. The aftermath of the riot forced Atlanta to confront the contradictions in its New South identity. The city that had promoted itself as progressive and modern had been revealed as capable of barbaric violence against its own citizens. National newspapers condemned the riot, damaging Atlanta's reputation and raising questions about its fitness to host major events or attract new businesses. Local leaders moved quickly to restore calm and rebuild Atlanta's tarnished image. Business executives recognized that continued racial violence would discourage investment and harm the city's economic prospects. A series of meetings between white and black leaders established ground rules for preventing future outbreaks while maintaining the basic structure of segregation. The riot's impact on Atlanta's African American community was profound and lasting. Many successful black families left the city, taking their skills and capital elsewhere. The psychological trauma of the violence created a generation of black Atlantans who understood that prosperity and education provided no protection from racial hatred. However, the riot also galvanized efforts to build stronger institutions within the black community. Churches, schools, and civic organizations worked to provide support and protection that could not be expected from white-controlled institutions. The Atlanta Life Insurance Company and other black-owned businesses expanded their operations, creating jobs and economic opportunities within the segregated community. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was teaching at Atlanta University during the riot, used his experience to refine his thinking about race relations and civil rights strategy. His scholarly work and activism would help lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would eventually challenge segregation throughout the South. The years following the riot saw Atlanta's leaders working to restore the city's reputation while carefully avoiding any challenge to the racial order that had produced the violence. Economic development continued, but with a new awareness of the social tensions that could threaten prosperity. The careful balance between progress and tradition that characterized the New South became even more delicate in post-riot Atlanta. World War I brought new challenges and opportunities to Atlanta as the city mobilized for the war effort. Camp Gordon, established just outside the city, trained thousands of soldiers while bringing federal spending and national attention. Local industries expanded to meet military contracts, while the port of Savannah channeled war materials through Atlanta's railroad network to ports along the Atlantic coast. The war years also accelerated social changes that had been building throughout the early 1900s. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers as men departed for military service. The suffrage movement gained momentum, with Atlanta women organizing to demand voting rights. Prohibition became a reality, transforming the city's social life and creating new forms of illegal activity. African American soldiers from Atlanta served with distinction in segregated units, despite facing discrimination and violence even while in uniform. Their service abroad exposed them to different racial attitudes and strengthened their determination to fight for equality at home. The return of these veterans would contribute to a new militancy within the black community that would challenge segregation in the post-war years. The The 1920s brought both prosperity and tension to Atlanta as the city participated in the national economic boom while grappling with rapid social changes. The population swelled past 200,000 as rural migrants continued to seek opportunities in the growing industrial city. New neighborhoods sprawled outward, connected by expanding streetcar networks and, increasingly, by automobiles. The automobile revolutionized Atlanta's development patterns and social life. Paved roads extended the city's reach into previously inaccessible areas, while car ownership provided unprecedented mobility for those who could afford it. Downtown parking became a growing problem as business districts struggled to accommodate the increasing number of vehicles. The rise of automobile culture coincided with significant changes in social behavior, particularly among young people. Jazz music, shorter skirts, and more relaxed attitudes toward traditional morality created generational conflicts that played out in Atlanta's churches, schools, and civic organizations. The city's religious leaders struggled to maintain their influence in an increasingly secular and cosmopolitan environment. Prohibition created new challenges for law enforcement while providing opportunities for organized crime. Illegal speakeasies operated throughout the city, often with the tacit approval of officials who were either paid to look the other way or who simply lacked the resources to enforce the unpopular law effectively. Atlanta became a major distribution center for illegal alcohol, with its railroad connections facilitating smuggling operations throughout the Southeast. The Ku Klux Klan experienced a dramatic revival during the 1920s, with Atlanta serving as the organization's national headquarters. Stone Mountain, just outside the city, became a pilgrimage site for Klan members and sympathizers who gathered for massive rallies and cross burnings. The Klan's influence extended into mainstream politics and civic organizations, creating an atmosphere of intimidation that affected both black and white residents. Despite these dark undercurrents, Atlanta's economy continued to expand throughout the decade. The city became a major distribution center for the Coca-Cola Company, which had been founded there in the 1880s. This internationally recognized brand became a symbol of Atlanta's global reach and entrepreneurial spirit. The company's success created numerous millionaires and provided employment for thousands of residents. The construction industry boomed as Atlanta's skyline reached ever higher. The Hertz building, completed in 1926, stood 17 stories tall and featured the latest in modern conveniences. Other skyscrapers followed, creating a downtown core that rivaled much larger cities. The architectural style of these buildings reflected the prosperity and optimism of the era, with elaborate facades and luxurious interior appointments. Cultural life flourished as Atlanta attracted national touring companies and developed its own artistic institutions. The Fox Theatre, opened in 1929, became one of the South's premier entertainment venues. This magnificent structure, designed in an elaborate Moorish style, hosted everything from vaudeville acts to grand opera. The theatre became a symbol of Atlanta's cultural aspirations and its determination to compete with established cities like New York and Chicago. Higher education expanded significantly during the 1920s as Atlanta's growing prosperity created demand for professional and technical training. Emory University moved from rural Georgia to a new campus in suburban Atlanta, bringing prestige and intellectual resources to the city. The Georgia Institute of Technology continued to grow, establishing itself as one of the nation's leading engineering schools. The stock market crash of 1929 ended Atlanta's Jazz Age prosperity with shocking suddenness. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared as the Great Depression settled over the city like a suffocating blanket. The construction boom ended abruptly, leaving half-finished buildings as monuments to vanished dreams. The human cost of the Depression was enormous as families lost their homes, savings, and livelihoods. Bread lines formed outside churches and relief organisations, while homeless encampments appeared in parks and vacant lots. The mill villages that had provided steady employment for thousands of workers became centres of desperation as textile demand collapsed. Atlanta's African American community, already disadvantaged by segregation, suffered disproportionately during the economic crisis. Black workers were typically the first to be fired and the last to be hired, while relief programs often excluded or shortchanged black families. The parallel economy that had developed along Auburn Avenue struggled to survive as its customer base lost purchasing power. However, the Depression also revealed the strength of Atlanta's community institutions and the resilience of its people. Churches of all denominations opened their doors to provide food and shelter for the needy. Civic organizations mobilized to address the crisis, while political leaders sought federal assistance to ease the suffering. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt brought New Deal programs that would transform Atlanta's landscape and provide relief for its struggling residents. The Works Progress Administration funded construction projects that put thousands of people back to work while creating lasting improvements to the city's infrastructure. New roads, bridges, parks, and public buildings rose throughout Atlanta, providing both employment and enhanced quality of life. The Civilian Conservation Corps established camps around Atlanta where young men worked on reforestation and park development projects. These programs not only provided jobs, but also created recreational facilities that served the city for decades to come. Grant Park, Piedmont Park, and numerous smaller green spaces were improved or created through Depression-era work programs. Federal housing programs began addressing Atlanta's chronic shortage of decent affordable housing. The Techwood Homes project, completed in 1936, was one of the nation's first public housing developments. While these projects were rigidly segregated, they provided modern apartments with indoor plumbing and electricity for families who had previously lived in substandard conditions. The Depression years also witnessed significant changes in Atlanta's political landscape as voters rejected traditional conservative leaders in favor of candidates who promised more aggressive action to address economic problems. This political realignment would have lasting effects on the city's approach to governance and its relationship with federal programs. By the late 1930s, Atlanta was beginning to recover from the worst effects of the Depression. New industries were establishing operations in the city, attracted by its transportation advantages and relatively low labor costs. The airport, which had been built during the 1920s, began attracting commercial aviation as airlines sought to establish routes connecting major southern cities. The approach of World War II would bring new challenges and opportunities to Atlanta, transforming the city once again as it mobilized for another national crisis. The pattern of destruction and renewal that had characterized Atlanta since its founding was about to repeat itself on an even grander scale. As the 1930s drew to a close, Atlanta stood poised between its remarkable recovery from Civil War destruction and an uncertain future that would test its resilience once more. The city that had risen from Sherman's ashes had proven its capacity for reinvention through economic boom and bust, social upheaval and progress, prosperity and depression. The Phoenix metaphor that had defined Atlanta's identity since Reconstruction remained as relevant as ever. This was a city that refused to accept defeat, that found opportunity in crisis, that rebuilt itself stronger after every setback. The greatest tests of that spirit still lay ahead, but Atlanta's history had already demonstrated the power of human determination to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The stage was set for another chapter in Atlanta's extraordinary story of transformation and renewal. World War II arrived like a thunderclap that shattered the lingering effects of the Great Depression and thrust Atlanta into a period of unprecedented transformation. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 galvanized the city's residents and industries, creating an atmosphere of urgent purpose that hadn't been seen since the Civil War. Within months, Atlanta had reinvented itself once again, this time as a crucial hub in America's arsenal of democracy. The federal government recognized Atlanta's strategic advantages almost immediately. The city's railroad network, which had made it a target for Sherman's army, now made it an ideal location for military installations and defense production. Camp Gordon expanded dramatically, eventually training over 300,000 soldiers during the war years. The sight of uniformed men marching through downtown streets became as common as the business suits that had previously dominated the city's sidewalks. Defense contractors flocked to Atlanta, drawn by its transportation links and available workforce. The Bell Aircraft Corporation established a massive plant that produced B-29 bombers, employing thousands of workers who had never imagined they would help build the aircraft that would eventually drop atomic bombs on Japan. The facility covered hundreds of acres and operated around the clock, its lights visible from miles away as a beacon of American industrial might. Lockheed followed with its own aircraft manufacturing operation, while numerous smaller companies contracted to produce everything from parachutes to ammunition. The Scripto Pen Company retooled its factories to manufacture precision instruments for military use. Even the Coca-Cola Company contributed to the war effort, following American troops to battlefields around the world and establishing the brand as a symbol of home for homesick soldiers. The transformation of Atlanta's economy during the war years was nothing short of remarkable. Unemployment, which had plagued the city throughout the Depression, virtually disappeared as factories struggled to find enough workers to meet production quotas. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs that had previously been reserved for men. Rosie the Riveter became as common a sight in Atlanta as anywhere in America. The demographic changes brought by wartime production created new social tensions and opportunities. Rural workers, both white and black, migrated to Atlanta seeking high-paying factory jobs. The city's population swelled beyond the capacity of existing housing, creating a severe shortage that forced families to double up in apartments and boarding houses. Trailer parks sprang up around the defense plants, providing temporary shelter for workers whose presence was essential, but whose stay was expected to be brief. For African Americans, the war created complex contradictions that would have lasting effects on Atlanta's social structure. Black workers found employment in defense plants, though typically in the lowest paying and most dangerous positions. The hypocrisy of fighting fascism abroad while maintaining segregation at home became increasingly difficult to ignore. The Double V campaign, promoting victory against fascism overseas and racism at home, gained momentum in Atlanta's black churches and civic organizations. The Atlanta Daily World, the city's leading black newspaper, carefully navigated the delicate balance between supporting the war effort and challenging racial discrimination. Editor C.A. Scott used his editorial platform to highlight the contributions of black workers and soldiers while advocating for equal treatment and opportunities. The paper's circulation grew throughout the war years as it became a voice for a community that was finding new strength and determination. Women's roles underwent dramatic changes that extended far beyond factory work. The Atlanta Women's Club and similar organizations shifted their focus from social activities to war support, organizing scrap drives, victory gardens, and volunteer services for military families. Professional women found new opportunities in fields that had been closed to them, though many understood that these gains might be temporary once the men returned from war. The city's cultural life adapted to wartime conditions with remarkable creativity. The Fox Theatre hosted Bond rallies and military shows, while local musicians performed at USO dances for soldiers on leave. Hollywood stars appeared at war bond drives, drawing massive crowds to Five Points and demonstrating Atlanta's importance as a regional entertainment center. Even in wartime, the city maintained its commitment to cultural sophistication and national prominence. Transportation systems strained under the unprecedented demands of wartime activity. The railroad network that had always been Atlanta's lifeline now carried military supplies, troops, and defense materials in quantities that tested its capacity. Terminal Station operated around the clock as troop trains departed for ports along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. The sight of young soldiers saying goodbye to their families became a daily reminder of the war's human cost. The airport, which had been a modest facility serving regional routes, expanded rapidly to handle military air traffic. Passenger service continued, but took second priority to the movement of military personnel and high-priority cargo. The runways were extended and improved, laying the foundation for Atlanta's eventual emergence as a major aviation hub in the post-war years. Rationing affected every aspect of daily life in wartime Atlanta. Gasoline shortages reduced automobile traffic, while rationing of rubber, metal, and other strategic materials forced residents to adapt their consumption patterns. Victory gardens appeared in backyards and vacant lots as families struggled to supplement rationed food supplies. The community spirit that emerged from these shared sacrifices strengthened social bonds and created a sense of common purpose that transcended many traditional divisions. The war years also accelerated technological changes that would reshape Atlanta's economy in the decades to come. Defense contractors introduced advanced manufacturing techniques and quality control procedures that would be adapted for civilian production after the war. Workers acquired new skills in electronics, precision machining, and assembly line production that would serve them well in the emerging post-war economy. Educational institutions adapted their programs to support the war effort while preparing for post-war Reconstruction. The Georgia Institute of Technology expanded its engineering programs and conducted research that contributed directly to military applications. Emory University's medical school trained doctors for military service while conducting research on diseases that affected troops in tropical climates. Even the historically black colleges played important roles, with Morehouse and Spelman producing teachers and administrators who would be needed in the post-war period. The approach of victory brought both celebration and uncertainty to Atlanta. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 triggered massive street parties in downtown Atlanta, with thousands of residents gathering to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany. The final victory over Japan in August brought even larger celebrations, but also the sobering realization that the wartime economy would soon end and the city would need to find new sources of growth and employment. The returning veterans brought new perspectives and ambitions that would reshape Atlanta's social and political landscape. Black veterans, in particular, returned with heightened expectations for equality and opportunity. Having served their country with distinction, they were less willing to accept the limitations of segregation and more determined to fight for their rights as full citizens. The GI Bill provided educational opportunities that had previously been unavailable to many working-class families. Atlanta's colleges and universities expanded to accommodate the influx of veteran students, while new technical schools emerged to provide job training for those seeking to enter the civilian workforce. This investment in human capital would pay dividends for decades as Atlanta developed the skilled workforce needed for modern industries. Defense contractors faced the challenge of converting from military to civilian production while maintaining the employment levels that had made Atlanta prosperous during the war. Some companies, like Bell Aircraft, closed their Atlanta operations entirely, leaving thousands of workers to seek new employment. Others successfully transitioned to civilian markets, using their wartime experience to manufacture consumer goods for the booming post-war economy. The housing shortage that had developed during the war years became even more acute as veterans returned and started families. The federal government responded with new housing programs that would transform Atlanta's suburban landscape. Veterans Administration loans made home ownership possible for middle-class families, while public housing projects expanded to serve lower-income residents. The late 1940s saw the beginning of the suburban boom that would reshape Atlanta's geography and social structure. New subdivisions appeared on the city's outskirts, connected to downtown by improved highways and expanded public transportation. These developments were strictly segregated, with restrictive covenants ensuring that the benefits of suburban living were reserved for white families. The civil rights movement that would eventually transform Atlanta and the entire South began to take shape during these post-war years. The legal challenges to segregation that had been building throughout the 1940s gained momentum as black veterans and professionals demanded the full citizenship they had been promised. Atlanta's black colleges provided intellectual leadership for this movement, while the city's black churches provided organizational infrastructure and moral authority. The successful integration of Major League Baseball in 1947 resonated strongly in Atlanta, where minor league teams had long been segregated. The Atlanta Crackers continued to exclude black players, but pressure was building for change throughout professional sports. The success of Jackie Robinson and other black athletes demonstrated the absurdity of segregation and provided powerful symbols of what integration might accomplish. Economic diversification accelerated during the late 1940s as Atlanta's leaders recognized the need to reduce dependence on any single industry or employer. The city actively recruited new businesses, offering incentives and promoting its advantages as a regional headquarters location. The combination of transportation infrastructure, skilled workforce, and relatively low costs made Atlanta attractive to companies seeking to establish southeastern operations. The Federal Reserve Bank's decision to locate a regional branch in Atlanta provided a significant boost to the city's financial sector. This designation recognized Atlanta's growing importance as a regional economic center and attracted other financial institutions to establish operations there. The presence of federal banking facilities enhanced the city's credibility and stability, making it more attractive to businesses and investors. Cultural institutions continued to evolve during the post-war years as Atlanta's growing prosperity supported expanded arts programming. The Atlanta Symphony Orchestra was established in 1945, providing the city with a professional musical organization that enhanced its cultural reputation. The High Museum of Art expanded its collections and programming, while the Atlanta Art Association promoted local artists and brought national exhibitions to the city. The transformation of Atlanta's skyline continued as new office buildings rose to accommodate the expanding business sector. The post-war economic boom created demand for modern office space that existing buildings could not meet. The architectural styles of these new structures reflected contemporary design trends, while contributing to Atlanta's image as a forward-looking, modern city. Television arrived in Atlanta in 1948 when WSB-TV began broadcasting, forever changing the city's media landscape and entertainment options. The new medium provided unprecedented opportunities for local businesses to reach regional markets while connecting Atlanta residents to national programming and news. The television industry would eventually become another important component of Atlanta's diversified economy. The Korean War, which began in 1950, provided another boost to Atlanta's defense-related industries while reinforcing the city's role as a military logistics center. Though the conflict was smaller than World War II, it demonstrated that the Cold War would require sustained military preparedness and continued defense spending. Atlanta's strategic location and industrial capacity ensured its continued importance in national defense planning. By 1950, Atlanta's population had grown to over 330,000, making it one of the fastest growing major cities in America. The metropolitan area was expanding even more rapidly as suburban development accelerated, and surrounding counties experienced unprecedented growth. The city that had risen from Civil War ashes was once again transforming itself, this time into a modern southern metropolis that would soon challenge much older cities for regional and national prominence. The stage was set for the most dramatic transformation in Atlanta's history as the civil rights movement prepared to challenge the segregation that had defined Southern society since Reconstruction. The economic prosperity and social changes of the war and post-war years had created conditions that would soon make the old racial order unsustainable. The phoenix that had risen from Sherman's fires was about to spread its wings once more, preparing for a flight that would carry it higher than anyone had dared imagine. The greatest chapters in Atlanta's remarkable story of renewal and reinvention were still to be written. The 1950s marks the beginning of the most transformative decade in Atlanta's history, as forces that had been building beneath the surface of a Southern society finally erupted into the open. The city that had rebuilt itself from Civil War ruins now faced a different kind of battle, one that would test its character and determine whether the promise of democracy could finally extend to all its citizens. The prosperity of the post-war boom had created a confident, modern Atlanta that bore little resemblance to the sleepy railroad town of earlier eras. Downtown bustled with activity as new office towers rose along Peachtree Street, their glass and steel facades reflecting the optimism of a city that seemed destined for greatness. The suburbs sprawled outward in all directions, connected by an expanding network of highways that made automobile ownership essential for middle-class life. Yet this surface prosperity masked deep inequalities that could no longer be ignored. The two Atlantas that had emerged during the Jim Crow era operated as separate worlds, with vastly different opportunities and expectations. White Atlanta enjoyed the benefits of economic growth, suburban expansion, and educational advancement, while Black Atlanta remained confined to overcrowded neighborhoods with inferior schools, limited job opportunities, and the constant humiliation of segregation. The catalyst for change came from an unexpected source: the children. In 1954, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education declared school segregation unconstitutional, sending shockwaves through Atlanta's white establishment. The ruling challenged the entire legal framework that had maintained racial separation since the 1890s, forcing the city's leaders to confront a future they had never imagined. Atlanta's response to Brown revealed both the pragmatism that had always characterized its leadership and the deep resistance to racial change that permeated Southern society. Unlike other Southern cities that defied the court order with massive resistance campaigns, Atlanta's business and political leaders chose a more cautious approach. They understood that violent confrontation would damage the city's reputation and harm its economic prospects, but they also knew that their white constituents were not ready to accept integration. The strategy that emerged became known as the Atlanta Way, an approach that emphasized gradual change, behind-the-scenes negotiations, and maintaining the city's image as progressive compared to the rest of the South. This philosophy would guide Atlanta through the turbulent decade ahead, producing significant changes while avoiding the worst violence that plagued other Southern cities. The Black community's response to Brown was immediate and organized. The NAACP chapter in Atlanta, led by experienced activists who had been fighting segregation for decades, filed suit to integrate the city's public schools. Churches throughout the Black community mobilized their congregations, providing meeting spaces, financial support, and moral authority for the growing civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr., who had grown up in Atlanta and returned to the city after his education at Morehouse College and Theological Seminary, emerged as a powerful voice for change. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., had already established himself as a prominent minister and civil rights leader, making the King family central to Atlanta's struggle for racial justice. The younger King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance found fertile ground in Atlanta's black community, which had a long tradition of education, organization, and strategic thinking about racial change. The city's historically black colleges provided intellectual leadership and meeting spaces, while successful black businesses along Auburn Avenue provided financial resources for the movement. The first major test of Atlanta's commitment to peaceful change came with the student sit-in movement that began in 1960. Black college students from Atlanta University, Morehouse, Spelman, and other institutions organized protests at segregated lunch counters throughout the downtown business district. These young activists, inspired by similar protests in other cities, brought a new militancy and urgency to the civil rights struggle. The sit-ins created a crisis for Atlanta's white business leaders, who found themselves caught between their desire to maintain segregation and their need to preserve the city's economic vitality. The protest disrupted business operations and generated negative publicity that threatened Atlanta's carefully cultivated image as a progressive southern city. Mayor William Hartsfield, who had guided Atlanta through its post-war growth, recognized that the old system could not be maintained indefinitely. Working with black and white leaders behind the scenes, he helped negotiate agreements that gradually desegregated public accommodations while avoiding the violent confrontations that were occurring elsewhere in the South. The process was neither smooth nor complete, but it demonstrated Atlanta's capacity for managed change that would become its hallmark throughout the civil rights era. The city's business community, led by organizations like the Chamber of Commerce, gradually accepted that segregation was bad for business and that peaceful integration was preferable to continued conflict. The election of Ivan Allen Jr. as mayor in 1961 accelerated Atlanta's transformation. Allen, a businessman who understood the economic costs of racial conflict, committed his administration to peaceful integration and positioned Atlanta as a model for other southern cities. His leadership during the civil rights years would earn him national recognition and help establish Atlanta's reputation as the city too busy to hate. The phrase "too busy to hate" became Atlanta's unofficial motto during the 1960s, capturing the pragmatic approach that prioritized economic development over ideological resistance to change. While other southern cities were consumed by racial violence and economic disruption, Atlanta continued to grow and prosper, attracting new businesses and residents who were drawn by its stability and opportunity. However, the reality was more complex than the slogan suggested. While Atlanta avoided the worst excesses of racial violence, the process of integration was neither quick nor painless. Resistance to change remained strong in many white neighborhoods and institutions, while black activists grew increasingly impatient with the slow pace of progress. The integration of Atlanta's public schools became a particular flashpoint, as white parents organized resistance campaigns and threatened to withdraw their children from the system. The city's leaders worked carefully to manage the process, beginning with token integration of a few schools and gradually expanding access over several years. The first black students to integrate Atlanta's white schools faced enormous challenges, enduring harassment, isolation, and constant pressure while trying to get an education. Their courage and persistence helped break down barriers and demonstrated that integration could work when properly managed and supported. Meanwhile, the broader civil rights movement was gaining momentum throughout the South, with Atlanta serving as a crucial organizational center. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, co-founded by Martin Luther King Jr., established its headquarters in the city, making Atlanta the unofficial capital of the nonviolent resistance movement. The presence of these national civil rights organizations brought increased attention to Atlanta, while also creating new pressures for change. The city found itself in the spotlight as journalists, activists, and government officials watched to see whether the Atlanta Way could successfully navigate the transition from segregation to integration. The March on Washington in 1963 included significant participation from Atlanta's black community, with buses carrying hundreds of residents to the nation's capital. The sight of Atlanta activists joining this historic demonstration reinforced the city's central role in the civil rights movement, while also building momentum for continued change at home. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided federal backing for the changes that Atlanta had been implementing gradually. These landmark laws removed legal barriers to integration and voting rights, giving the federal government enforcement power that had been lacking in earlier efforts to combat segregation. For Atlanta, federal civil rights legislation validated the approach it had been taking and provided cover for business leaders who wanted to move beyond segregation but needed political protection from white backlash. The city could now point to federal requirements as justification for changes that many had wanted to make for economic reasons. The transformation of Atlanta's political landscape accelerated as black voter registration increased dramatically following the Voting Rights Act. The black community, which had been effectively excluded from political participation since the 1890s, suddenly became a significant electoral force that could no longer be ignored by white politicians. The election of Maynard Jackson as Atlanta's first black mayor in 1973 marked a watershed moment in the city's history. Jackson's victory demonstrated that Atlanta had truly changed, that political power could shift from white to black hands without violence or economic collapse. His election also symbolized the broader transformation of the South and the success of the civil rights movement in achieving meaningful political change. Under Jackson's leadership, Atlanta continued to grow and prosper while also addressing the needs of its black residents, who had been neglected for decades. City contracts and employment opportunities opened up to black businesses and professionals, while neighborhood development programs targeted areas that had received little attention during the segregation era. The 1960s and early 1970s also saw dramatic changes in Atlanta's physical landscape as urban renewal projects reshaped large portions of the city. Interstate highways carved through established neighborhoods, often displacing black communities while improving transportation connections to the suburbs. The construction of the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium provided a home for major league sports teams while demonstrating the city's growing national prominence. The arrival of the Atlanta Braves baseball team in 1966 and the Atlanta Falcons football team in the same year marked Atlanta's emergence as a major league city in every sense. These professional sports franchises provided new sources of civic pride and national visibility, while also contributing to the local economy through jobs, spending, and tourism. The development of the MARTA rapid transit system during the 1970s represented Atlanta's commitment to modern urban transportation solutions. The rail and bus network connected the city's far-flung suburbs to the downtown core, while providing mobility options for residents who could not afford automobile ownership. Higher education continued to play a crucial role in Atlanta's development as the city's colleges and universities expanded their programs and facilities. The Atlanta University Center maintained its position as the world's largest consortium of historically black institutions, while Georgia Tech and Emory University attracted students and faculty from around the nation and world. The combination of educational institutions, growing businesses, and cultural attractions made Atlanta increasingly attractive to young professionals and families seeking opportunities in the New South. The city's population continued to grow throughout the 1960s and 1970s, while the metropolitan area expanded even more rapidly as suburban development accelerated. Cultural life flourished as Atlanta's prosperity supported expanded arts programming and facilities. The establishment of the Atlanta Arts Alliance and the construction of the Memorial Arts Center provided world-class venues for theater, music, and dance performances. The city's symphony orchestra gained national recognition, while local theater companies and dance troupes contributed to a vibrant cultural scene. The transformation of Atlanta's economy continued throughout this period as traditional industries gave way to new sectors that would define the city's future. While textiles and other manufacturing remained important, the growth of service industries, finance, and corporate headquarters operations created new types of jobs and attracted different kinds of residents. The selection of Atlanta as the southeastern headquarters for numerous national corporations reflected the city's growing importance as a regional business center. Companies were drawn by the transportation infrastructure, skilled workforce, and favorable business climates that had made Atlanta attractive for more than a century. By the mid-1970s, Atlanta had successfully navigated the transition from a segregated southern city to an integrated metropolitan area that served as a model for racial progress throughout the nation. The transformation had not been without costs and complications, but the city had demonstrated that change was possible when leaders were willing to adapt and communities were committed to peaceful solutions. The phoenix that had risen from Civil War ashes had once again reinvented itself, this time emerging as a symbol of racial reconciliation and economic opportunity in the New South. The city's greatest challenges and achievements still lay ahead, but Atlanta had proven once more that it possessed the resilience and adaptability to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The stage was now set for Atlanta to claim its place among America's truly great cities, a metropolis that combined southern charm with international sophistication, historical consciousness with forward-looking vision. The next chapter in this remarkable story would see Atlanta reach for heights that even its most optimistic boosters had never imagined possible. The selection of Atlanta as the host city for the 1996 Summer Olympic Games represented the ultimate validation of its remarkable transformation from Civil War ruins to international prominence. When the announcement came in September 1990, the entire city erupted in celebration as residents realized that their phoenix had truly soared to global heights. The decision to award the Centennial Olympics to Atlanta shocked much of the world, which had expected the Games to go to Athens, Greece, in recognition of the Olympic movement's ancient origins. Instead, the International Olympic Committee chose a Southern American city that many international observers knew little about, recognizing Atlanta's combination of modern infrastructure, organizational capability, and symbolic significance as the heart of the civil rights movement. The 7-year preparation period that followed became another defining chapter in Atlanta's story of continuous reinvention. The city embarked on the largest construction and renovation program in its history, transforming neighborhoods, building world-class athletic facilities, and upgrading infrastructure on a scale that dwarfed even the post-war boom years. Centennial Olympic Park emerged in the heart of downtown, creating a 21-acre green space where railroad yards and urban decay had previously dominated the landscape. The park's fountains, walkways, and performance venues provided a gathering place that the city had lacked for decades, while its design incorporated elements that celebrated Atlanta's history and Olympic legacy. The construction of Olympic venues spread throughout the metropolitan area, bringing development and investment to neighborhoods that had been neglected for generations. The Olympic Stadium rose on the site of Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, designed to serve first as the centerpiece of the Games and then as the home of the Atlanta Braves baseball team. Swimming and diving competitions would take place at the Georgia Tech Aquatic Center, while basketball games were scheduled for the Georgia Dome. Transportation infrastructure received massive upgrades as the city prepared to welcome hundreds of thousands of visitors from around the world. Hartsfield Atlanta International Airport expanded its facilities and improved its connections to downtown, reinforcing its position as one of the world's busiest aviation hubs. The MARTA transit system added new stations and improved service throughout the metropolitan area. The Olympic preparations also accelerated urban renewal projects that had been planned for years, but lacked the funding or political will to move forward. Neighborhoods near downtown received streetscape improvements, new housing developments, and enhanced public services. The Games provided the catalyst and justification for investments that transformed large portions of the city. However, the Olympic preparations also revealed ongoing challenges and inequalities that prosperity alone could not address. The displacement of low-income residents to make way for Olympic facilities and infrastructure improvements created new hardships for communities that had already faced decades of neglect. The promise that Olympic development would benefit all Atlanta residents proved difficult to fulfill in practice. The torch relay that preceded the Games created unprecedented excitement throughout Georgia and the Southeast, with communities competing for the honor of hosting the Olympic flame as it made its way toward Atlanta. The relay route was carefully planned to showcase the region's history and natural beauty while building anticipation for the Games themselves. When the opening ceremonies finally took place on July 19, 1996, Atlanta presented itself to the world as a city that embodied the Olympic ideals of international cooperation, athletic excellence, and peaceful competition. Muhammad Ali's lighting of the Olympic cauldron provided one of the most memorable moments in Olympic history, while the ceremony celebration of Southern culture introduced global audiences to Atlanta's unique blend of tradition and modernity. The Games themselves exceeded most expectations, with world records broken and memorable performances that would be remembered for decades. Carl Lewis won his final Olympic gold medal in Atlanta, while swimmer Amy Van Dyken became the first American woman to win 4 gold medals in a single Olympics. The basketball Dream Team dominated their competition, while soccer matches drew enthusiastic crowds to stadiums throughout the Southeast. However, the Olympic experience was not without its dark moments. The bombing in Centennial Olympic Park on July 27th killed 2 people and injured over 100 others, casting a shadow over the remainder of the Games. The attack demonstrated that even Atlanta's remarkable transformation could not insulate it from the hatred and violence that plagued American society. The city's response to the bombing revealed the resilience and determination that had characterized Atlanta throughout its history. Rather than allowing fear to dominate, residents and visitors rallied together, determined not to let terrorism derail the celebration of international unity and athletic achievement. The Games continued with enhanced security measures, while the spirit of the Olympics remained intact. The economic impact of hosting the Olympics extended far beyond the Games themselves. The global television coverage provided Atlanta with unprecedented publicity, showcasing the city to billions of viewers around the world. International businesses that had never considered Atlanta as a location for their American operations suddenly recognized its potential as a gateway to the Southeast. Tourism increased dramatically during and after the Olympics, as visitors who had come for the Games returned with their families and friends to explore Atlanta's attractions. The Georgia Aquarium, World of Coca-Cola, and other tourist destinations that opened in subsequent years benefited from the city's enhanced international profile. The post-Olympic years brought both opportunities and challenges as Atlanta worked to capitalize on its global moment while addressing ongoing urban problems. The economic boom of the 1990s continued into the new millennium, with technology companies joining traditional industries in choosing Atlanta as their regional headquarters. The city's airport maintained its position as the world's busiest, while the metropolitan area's population continued to grow at a remarkable pace. Real estate development accelerated throughout the region as suburban sprawl reached into counties that had been rural just decades earlier. Shopping malls, office parks, and residential subdivisions transformed the landscape, creating a metropolitan area that stretched for dozens of miles in every direction from the original city centre. The Beltline project, conceived in the early 2000s, represented Atlanta's latest attempt to manage growth while creating livable communities. This ambitious plan called for converting abandoned railroad corridors into parks, trails, and transit connections that would link neighbourhoods throughout the city. The project promised to address transportation challenges while providing recreational opportunities and spurring additional development. Cultural institutions continued to flourish as Atlanta's prosperity supported expanded programming and new facilities. The High Museum of Art underwent major expansions, while the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra gained international recognition. The city's film and television industry grew dramatically, earning Atlanta the nickname Hollywood of the South as producers discovered the advantages of shooting in Georgia. Higher education remained a crucial component of Atlanta's economy and identity. The Atlanta University Center continued to produce leaders in business, politics, and civil rights, while Georgia Tech established itself as one of the world's premier technological universities. Emory University's medical school and research programs contributed to Atlanta's emergence as a major center for healthcare and biotechnology. The 2008 financial crisis tested Atlanta's resilience once again, as the real estate bubble that had fueled much of the region's growth suddenly burst. Unemployment soared, construction projects were abandoned, and many residents lost their homes and savings. The crisis revealed the vulnerabilities in an economy that had become heavily dependent on real estate development and financial services. However, Atlanta's response to the Great Recession demonstrated once more the adaptability and determination that had characterized the city throughout its history. Rather than simply waiting for recovery, community leaders and entrepreneurs worked to diversify the economy and create new opportunities. Technology startups emerged throughout the metropolitan area, while established companies adapted their operations to serve changing markets. The election of Qasim Reed as mayor in 2009 brought new leadership during a challenging period, while the city continued to attract major events and investments despite economic difficulties. The recovery was gradual but steady, with employment levels eventually returning to pre-recession levels and new development projects breaking ground throughout the region. From Cherokee settlements to Olympic glory, from Sherman's flames to civil rights triumph, Atlanta's story reads like something from mythology itself. In less than 2 centuries, this remarkable city has died and been reborn more times than perhaps any other metropolis in American history. Each transformation has left it stronger, more resilient, more determined to reach ever greater heights. Today, as Atlanta continues to evolve and grow, that same phoenix spirit burns as brightly as ever, promising that whatever challenges lie ahead, this extraordinary city will meet them with the same courage and vision that carried it from the ashes of war to the pinnacle of international recognition.